It's with great pleasure that I get to introduce our next guest speaker. Delphine Davan has a long-standing relationship with Heroes at BioRender. Delphine is the Senior Director of Communications and Public Affairs at IMV Incorporated, a biopharmaceutical company that develops a novel class of cancer immunotherapies. Her colleagues have credited her for major improvements in IMV's increase in visibility and scientific credibility. And we are so fortunate that she has also assisted us at BioRender, providing many amazing insights over the years to help us build out templates, color palettes, posters, and a lot more. A real design guru, Delphine is joined here today by our very own Shiz Aoki, our CEO and co-founder, who will be bringing you actionable design tips for posters as we're now back to school and conference season. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Delphine and Shiz.
Hi, everyone. This is my pleasure to be here today. So I assume that Natalie is going to pass the slide for me. Thank you very much. So yeah, this is my pleasure to be here today with you for Visualize 2021 by BioRender. And really, it's been a pleasure working with you guys for the last 2 years that I am with IMV now. As Jeff explained, IMV is a biopharmaceutical company, and we develop a novel class of immunotherapies. I think that the concept of the passport, the T-cell passport, is very appropriate to what IMV does, since we have these immunotherapies that generate targeted T-cells against cancer cells. So that's definitely very appropriate. So before going into all the details, and I think that we have 20 minutes or so to spend together, and I would like to give you a few tips about how to build great posters. And it's not just about the design, but how you think about the design, how you visualize your design as well. And we can then start with the next slide, please. So, and the first thing, I may state the obvious here, but the first thing is really to get organized and, of course, to anticipate. And for whatever communication thing you want to build, posters, presentations, manuscript, I really encourage you to start by organizing your work, organizing your ideas, and plan as much as possible in advance what you're going to talk. And the first thing to think about is your target audience. Next slide, please. And your target audience, because I'm afraid to say that you have to sell your work to your target audience. And you need to think about who is your target audience and fit into their shoes and understand what's in it for them, really. What will they do with the different elements that you're going to discuss about what will they do with the takeaways? What's the so what for them, and why would they be interested in your work? So think about your target audience as customers that you need to raise attention, and really it starts from there. Next slide, please. With your audience, you have already certainly your experience and the results of your experiment. So you need to think about the takeaways. So the takeaways are really the messages that you want your audience to go back home with. And your takeaways, you should have 3, 4 at the maximum takeaways for your presentation. And I will definitely insist on the maximum of 4. More than 4 is really too many, and they will forget maybe a few of them. So your takeaways represent your conclusions. And your takeaways, you need to give them a context, because without context, context is everything, and give the structure and the reason why your takeaways are so important for your audience. And the context is your introduction. And between your introduction and your conclusions, everything, I'm sorry to say, that is secondary. But you need to make sure that what's in between, which are your experiments and your results, will support your takeaways. And this is all the goal of why you have done so many experiments, why you have spent so many hours and days and sometimes weeks working on experiments to get this final result. Not just for the result, but for the meaning of this result for your audience. So focus on your audience and then on your takeaways first. Then make sure that you have a very clear idea of what you want to convey. And then you can start using these elements to build and craft your poster. Even artists, they are usually sketching their masterpiece before doing the whole entire project. So make sure that you have all your elements in mind before drafting your poster. Next slide. Now you have your elements, and you know very much that kind of structure for your posters, but here it's a classic landscape poster, but sometimes you have portrait, you have very different type of posters. And it starts with the guideline from your conference. Next slide. So once you have all the elements for your poster, that you know exactly what you're going to talk about, which data you're going to present to support your takeaways, and how to give a context, to a meaningful context to your takeaways, you need to double check a few things. And you may feel that there are constraints, that they give you an extra layer of difficulties, but it helps conferences to have a consistent visual across the conference. And most of the time they have guidelines. So be sure that you stick with the guidelines that are provided by the conference. Here is just an example from upcoming conference. And make sure that you use all the guidelines that is required by this conference. You may also have, yes, next slide, please. You may also have a brand guide. So at IMV, when I arrived, I wanted to make sure that we have a brand guide, because we need to make sure that our messages are consistent and that we use the same colors all the time, the same fonts, the same images. It may sound superficial, but it helps to convey a very consistent image to our audience, whatever it is, and for everything that is put out there for IMV, we use this brand guide. Of course, if the conference brand guide is different, we go with the conference brand guide. But otherwise, our brand guide helps us really to have a very harmonized and consistent image of the company. For those who do not have a brand guide, I would definitely recommend to stick with very basic elements and use Arial as a font, and make sure that you are consistent in your font colors as well, and the size that you use. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Next slide, please. Here, I really wanted to highlight a few mistakes that I've seen many times, in the designs, is using too much text. We tend to copy paste from the abstract or other material that were used previously. We use small fonts because when using too much text, you need more space, or you use small fonts to put more information. Sometimes I saw things written in capital letters, which sounds like you're screaming, and please avoid that. It's important to give titles to make sure that the way you look at poster, you know exactly which category the box belongs to. Don't use silly fonts because it's not nice. Even some look really nice, usually on poster, on scientific poster. We prefer to stay with very regular font like Arial and other things. Colors, be careful of the different colors that you, previous slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, the colors, just make sure that your colors are really reasonable. You can use a few different colors as accent color. You may have noticed that we have a very noticeable green in the brand guide of IMV. And make sure that you also stick with no more than 2 font types. And of course, don't overwhelm with information your text box. Otherwise, it's awful, just like the text I have here. Next slide, please. So just like Jeff introduced a little bit earlier, we had the pleasure to work with BioRender, Shiz, Francesca, all the team of BioRender on these poster templates, and we use them quite often, as much as possible, actually, for our presentations. And you can see here that the title is really clear. We have our logo. It's not all conferences that accept logos, but we have our logos here. And also you can see that the different boxes are very distinguished from each other. And you can see exactly which one is the abstract, the material method, the results. And these titles here for each areas, this is the only place where I will allow this capital letter, just to make sure that they stand out from the rest of the poster. And you can see that we have used this green color also in the middle to accentuate a little bit the result part and make sure that we have these different parts between the abstract, material method, the conclusion, and the result in between. The most important here is that we have used as many pictures as possible. So this is just an illustration of what ideal template, ideal poster should look like, but really we try to use as many pictures as we can in our poster presentation. And you can see that the conclusion, there are 4 different bullets. So, okay, the bullets are a little bit big here, but we are used to fix that. But you can see there's only 4 takeaways and very distinguishable, because you can see that, you know, it's a sequence and it's very clear. You can see the flow is easy to read. This is the very usual flow that everyone is used to: introduction, material method, result, conclusion. And it's easy to read because you may notice these blank spaces around the boxes, and there's no outline on the boxes. I know that a lot of scientists like to have the outline colored, but really giving space, blank space around this area help your brain to navigate the poster, and visually, you know, your brain is not overwhelmed with all of this information because you have picture, you have blank space, you know, and it is really attractive for people who can just see that when they walk by your poster. And a few tips also here. Another tip is that we use QR code. it is quite common right now, but we were one of the first to use it. It's easy to use and easy to redirect the people you're talking to the poster online, because we were used to have, of course, this PDF paper, and but no one uses paper anymore. So it's good to have this QR code, then everyone can access your paper and also have your contact details very easily. Next slide, please. So these are just a few tips that I just mentioned: the title, concise. Also, please think about your audience and the language. You know, I'm used to say that we should talk as much as possible with a plain language, and because even scientists, you know, sometimes we appreciate to have that kind of plain language that help us to understand. Visuals to tell a story, the graphic, the color and font, make sure that everything is really effective. Consistency is key for everything you use in your poster, and really avoid text as much as possible. So keep your sentence as short as possible, use bullet points. It's really, the less is more, yeah, but it's really to, you don't have to put all the information in your poster. The goal is not only to convey your key messages to your target audience, but also to engage with your audience and you know, generate a discussion, a meaningful discussion with the people that want to learn more about your experiment and what you're doing in your lab. Next slide, please. And I cannot just stay here talking about in-person presentation. I'm very happy to see that many conferences now are getting back to a kind of normal sense. And now, you know, we have all experienced those virtual conferences, and I do not think that we would go back to only in-person meetings. I think that hybrid conferences will become the norm. And so we will have to work both on poster presentation for the in-person meetings, but also on the virtual e-posters that will be shared online, and which is very, very good for your communication. Honestly, it is the best way to disseminate the information, because the posters, that's not really something that we like to share on social media, for example, because it's too heavy. There are too much information on a poster. But the e-poster is really perfect, and most of the time there are video recorded, and this is just the perfect way. Videos are really the most used tool and channel to convey messages. And the good thing is also that most of the conference they allow only a 5-minute speech for the presentation, so you have to work on the script. And I noticed that with our scientists that this process of writing a script helped them to really focus more on their key messages and how to make sure that they are conveyed in a concise and very clear, intelligible way. And keep in mind that a 5-minute speech is around 750 words, which is really, it goes fast. It's not easy, but it is really interesting. And honestly, even in-person meeting at a conference, you should not, the description of your poster should not last more than 5 minutes. You should think about discussing with your audience, really engaging with them, and make sure that they remember you, not just your poster and your result, but also the human interaction that you could have with them. So really think about engaging with your audience and have this meaningful scientific discussion. Next slide. just to tell you thank you very much. And now I pass on to Shiz.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Delphine. Hopefully you can all hear me okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Fantastic. And actually, this is, you've laid the groundwork very beautifully for my part of the talk. And I'm going to be building upon that with just a few additional design tips, again, for better science posters. But you couldn't have said it better. I couldn't have said it better than you did, Delphine. So thank you so much for all of the really good tips there, and your years of experience. Obviously, weigh in on that too. And I kind of wanted to also reiterate just how different a lot of conferences. I was talking with the folks in the chat there, how different every conference poster restrictions are. We're hoping that one day it'll be a little bit more streamlined, but for now we'll have to really play by their rules, their dimensions, the content, all of that. So we're always working within certain parameters, but just to get a lay of the land, posters come in all shapes and sizes and colors. This was a snapshot from SFN. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, Society for Neuroscience. Tens of thousands of posters, lots of trees killed. But, I think, again, in the chats, people were saying that they kind of miss the in-person experience. And I think it's really going to be a hybrid digital versus in-person world when it comes to posters. Although a lot of people are, again, adopting the digital poster realm. I took a few snapshots of some really beautiful posters during that conference. I think some of them were really nicely laid out. If some of you remember, some printed on fabric, some a little bit larger, some more simple than others. But just wanted to kind of get our feet wet in the different types of posters that I'm sure you've all made before. The analogy I like to use sometimes is comparing getting lost in a city like Chicago to getting lost in a city like Paris, which is wonderful if you're on vacation. But posters, you're not always going to be standing beside it. And I'm, kind of reiterating what Delphine said already, but really the story should be told by anybody walking by and without you needing to narrate them, through the story. It should really be standalone, kind of like a painting. It's not a presentation where you're always going to be there standing next to the poster. There are presentation sessions, but you really want to think of it in the way that a map is easy to read. So that's grid lines, left to right directionality, up to down directionality, keeping that in mind. So serve them up a really easy to follow map. There's a couple of sort of outdated styles that I guess I'll just call out that I usually see in designs, very tactical. So rounded corners, I don't know why, but it tends to give it a little bit of a dated look. Drop shadows, we try to keep that out of a lot of designs in the design world as professionals. Gradients, really hard to do and difficult to do tastefully, as you can see, not only for just aesthetic, but legibility. It's hard to create graphics that lay on top of gradients really well because it goes from dark to light. So how do you pick a font color that will actually mesh well on top of a gradient? What color do you use? Is it gray? It'll kind of get lost in the middle value. If it's too light, it'll get lost in the lighter values. So be careful of that. Word art, I don't think we see much of that anymore. And then fancy bullet points. Here's an example I just pulled from Google of why gradient backgrounds also kind of give it this optical illusion of a curled edge. And if you all have experienced this, having to uncurl a poster out of a poster tube, you're just going to make that visual worse. So again, just the point is to avoid gradient backgrounds really wherever possible. This includes figures, poster designs, presentations. You can tell here the rounded corners, I would have sharpened that up. And as Delphine said, use the borders of the text and the images as the sort of hallways or the visual dividers. You don't always need to put everything in a box, in a box, in a box. And actually one thing that we use, as designers is actually grid lines. If you walk into any design studio, you're going to see everyone's monitors covered in these really sort of obnoxiously colored grid lines, and they're obnoxiously colored for a reason so that you know for sure it's probably not part of the design. So they're kind of like, lines on a highway where you have to drive within certain, spaces. As designers, we place these guides down so that we know where to put content and where not to put content. And it's not to be perfect. You literally just put down these lines. BioRender has them, PowerPoint has them, Photoshop has them. Most software has them. And the main reason, again, is to just make sure that you're putting content where they're supposed to. And also to pick a consistent border around the entirety of the poster, in between the rows and the columns, even within the column where the text ends and begins. You'd be surprised if you hold those borders true all the way around your design. It creates this sort of harmonious design throughout your entire illustration or poster. And the idea really is to be able to sort of read the story again from top to down, left to right. Those visual spaces create the hallways and the breathing room for your eye to be able to travel around between the content. It's really important to have that white space. Here's a little example of maybe a before and an after of those sort of visual hallways, we can call them. And again, Delphine showed a really beautiful example with the IMV poster that followed these rules really well. And again, the grid lines don't have to be perfect. I would just pick a dimension. Maybe it's half an inch, a centimeter or two, and then sort of try to follow that along the entirety of the poster, again, outside of the edges, within the columns, between maybe the title and your first figure. Just pick one unit and follow that all the way around. Here's some sample data I grabbed that I sometimes like to use this sort of box trick. So even within a figure, if you find that, it's not quite aligned and I don't know how to align it, sometimes what I do is I draw boxes around the content. And then what I do is sort of shift it so that, again, we get those perfect little spaces in between the box. Because sometimes if it's not in a box, you can't really tell the spacing very well. And then just simply remove the boxes and, add in those numbers back. So sometimes that helps by, irregular shaped objects, stick it in a box, shift those boxes around, remove those. So it's kind of like grid lines, interactive grid lines. And that'll help you better align your figures. Again, the sort of TLDR, too long didn't read format. Maybe you'd like to highlight a section of your poster. Maybe one area is really important to the story, as Delphine mentioned. Sometimes it's the results. I would say a lot of the times it's the results. So you could put maybe a colored background, keep it subtle, but a colored background behind that section to really emphasize that area. But the general reading direction, again, should be left to right, up to down. Agree that text is the enemy, as Delphine mentioned. So, really keep your title to a minimum number of characters and maximum font size. These people look way too excited to be making a science poster. But I grabbed this picture because it's actually a really quick way to gut check. I used to do this when I made a lot of posters that were ultimately printed. And that feeling of when you send your poster to the printer and then you go to pick it up and you're horrified because the font's tiny or the font's really blurry or everything is like too big. You could have made things a little smaller. A cheap and easy way to test to see if everything kind of will look good in situ or the day of is to try projecting the poster on like a monitor or a big screen as big as you can access wherever you are. I know we're not in person, a lot of us, but if you are and you have access to, a projector screen, and then take like a measuring tape to the size that it'll probably be printed at. And then, stand beside it, see if it kind of reads well. It won't be perfect, but it kind of gives you a gut check of how big it'll be. That's if you finish it in time and you're not, scrambling to the 25th hour to go to the printers. But, if you've got the time, why not? This is a trick that we use in the art world, the fine art world. Sometimes when we get really into the nitty gritty and you're zoomed in at 400%, a lot of you might be using PowerPoint at 400% zoom. Make sure you zoom out, because ultimately when people walk by your poster, they're going to judge it from a distance. They're not going to be walking by with their nose to the paper. So you should really look at the poster design as a whole. That means zooming out often, not putting your nose to the paper or to PowerPoint, but to really step back and see, how does it look as a whole? Is there a figure in my intro that's clashing with my figure in my conclusion or results? Are the colors conflicting? Am I saying that the dendritic cells are purple in one figure, but then they're pink in the conclusion figure? You'll have to make those adjustments, because you don't have the luxury like in a presentation where it's slide to slide to slide. The poster kind of shows all the dirty laundry in one go. So you have to make sure that from the beginning to end, everything is harmonious. The designs are clear, colors consistent, spacing is consistent, font sizes are consistent. I even like to go in and adjust the font size for the figures, because sometimes your figures can have really big labels in one figure, really tiny in another, because you've pulled it in from like a publication or something. So a little bit of tweaking is needed, again, if you can afford the time. And I'm just going to step over really quick to BioRender to give a couple of more, figure-specific tips. And let's see here. I've only got 4 minutes here to wrap up, so I'll try to go through this pretty quickly. There's a couple of ways to align objects in BioRender. Again, I saw in the chat that a few people actually use BioRender to make their posters. That's incredible. But if you're going to use grid lines like we had just talked about, we have the ability to add that in. So again, you can see here within BioRender, you can add in lines like so. If you didn't know we had that, you just simply go to the ruler and click down. And then you can kind of align objects according to those grid lines. We also have what's called a, sorry, I'm going to delete these all. We have what's called a graph paper or grid system that you can also use if you kind of just want to use that as a guide. We also have the enable alignment function. This is for all those people that love to align things better in their figure. I know I'm one of those people. So you see all these little lines that pop up. This is a nice way to auto-align as you're going. So you see these 4 antibodies are now evenly spaced because it's telling me it is. Oops. There we go. Or the actual align feature. So if I take these 4 antibodies and say they're all kind of scattered everywhere and I want to align them all, I can come up here to align, evenly distribute, and then align maybe by its middle. There we go. Thinking about the composition. So as you said, left to right, up to down, at least, for most of the world, we read in that direction. I would say the M shape direction is definitely following that sort of poster directionality, intro, methods, results, conclusion kind of thing. Kind of follow this M pattern. So I would focus on that for posters. And then what I like to do as well is within the figure, I still try to make sure that the directionality that people are reading the figure is consistent. So if I look at this figure, and we've used this before as an example, I like to use like a marker to trace, which direction is the content going. I'm seeing something like this right now, if I were to read from beginning to the end, which doesn't really follow any of the principles that we've talked about here. There's a fork in the road, there's left to right, but then there's this cyclical pattern. And sometimes all it takes is just doing a little bit of nudging, a little bit of cleanup. And then numbering is really key. So here we go. We've got a nice Z formation, very clean. And then we've, added these sort of numbers 1 to 8. Numbers are really important because, again, you're not going to be there to walk through your figure all the time. And this is a really nice way to lead the viewer's eye without too much direction. And then, again, as a whole, a poster as a whole, that reading directionality should be up, down, and left to right. So I think we're doing a pretty good job here of that sort of M pattern. So just a bit of a rule of thumb there when making posters. Directionality of reading is really important. Sometimes I see it going all different directions and you kind of lose your audience right then and there. Okay. And last thing I'll point out is just a small note about fonts. And I think Delphine did a great job again of mentioning this. But don't be afraid to really be bold about the hierarchy of your text. So in this case, these are sort of blending in with the label sizes. I'm going to go ahead and just boost that to be nice and large. Sometimes I'll even bold it. And again, people are going to be reading it from a distance, so you can actually afford to go a little bit larger than usual. I'm going to insert a shape with a text in it. We have these pre-made numbers and letters that create a perfectly circular number. And all I have to do is Alt-drag to copy that. And then, change that to a 2, change this to a 3. There we go. 1, 2, 3. Much cleaner, much more easy to read. And again, on the grand scheme of things, if I stick this into a poster, it'll read quite well. And I think I'll wrap up there, but I did want to give a little bit of a freebie of some free templates that we made using Google Slides. Admittedly, it's not the best software, until BioRender creates something better, or PowerPoint, I guess, improves. I've sort of set up a few templates here for you all to use. I guess what I can do is stick it in the chat. Hopefully you all can access it. This one is a vertical template. This one's a horizontal one. It's by no means the perfect template to use. And I hope, all thousands of you aren't going to crash Google Slides as we work on this. But it's a, maybe a good rule of thumb just to look at how clean the boxes can be. And lastly, when you're making figures, put them in the design as you're doing it. Don't do it last minute. You can see here, I threw in the figure in the left just to see how we would register at a large scale, that sort of stepping back feeling. Make sure you do that with your posters, regardless of the dimensions. And I think I am now over time. So I'm going to pause there, see if we have any questions, but otherwise, I'm going to come back here to my slide deck. And obviously wanted to thank Delphine for joining us for this poster session. I think this could have been like a half-day session where we did a whole workshop on how to design a poster, but thank you for condensing it and sharing your knowledge with us. And also wanted to give a little bit of a teaser for tomorrow. I know I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but we'll be starting again at 11 a.m. Eastern.